the format that I want to use here is just a couple quick intro slides to talk about some of the general trends that we're seeing across the industry related to urban planning and urban space making and the infrastructure that supports that. And then in the second half, we have a large project here in Chicago that WSP has been supporting on across multiple disciplines that we have a video for. Because of the sensitive nature of the project, I decided just to use the publicly available information. I can kind of talk through the presentation. Then there's also speakers that are in the background presenting as well from the original recording. Which I never like doing that, but I think in this particular case, it's the best bet.
That's great. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for joining. We'll just kind of go into it. You know, for WSP and for myself at a personal level, when I look at the history and role of the cities, I just find them so exciting and incredibly complex. They are truly an ecosystem that touches so many parts of our humanity. So at a high level, I always often think about their role as a cultural exchange, as a technology hub, as an information hub, and perhaps most importantly, as large economic generators. I don't know if you've ever seen some of the maps regarding where the GDP for the world or for the United States or any country comes from. The cities often are the biggest generators of revenue. And that is a complex interaction of the clumping of individuals with talents and skills and the exchange and transactions that occur between them. And the city, the urban space, urban design is the facilitator of that interaction. And that interaction is what generates the gross domestic product or the associated taxes with that. What we've seen over really the last 200-300 years is just an increase in urbanization. That's not a new trend. I'm sure you're roughly familiar with that trend at a global scale, but it's happening at a phenomenal rate and is continuing to do so. And our cities have always struggled to respond to these new innovations and the rapid population growths and shifts. And through globalization, of course, we saw massive shifts in population as well. So some cities grew and others began to shrink. And what we're seeing now as we move into the information economy and the revitalization of manufacturing at different scales, and come beyond just the focus on heavy manufacturing, is the revitalization of the urban cores within the United States. And no place is this more predominant than, say, in the Midwest, where a lot of the earlier manufacturing left for various reasons, and the population with it. And it's taken about 50 plus years to really recover and draw talent, draw the intellect, the human capital back under new industries, new ways of generating revenue, new ways of generating economic transactions. Now that we're there, our cities have had to adjust from many of them were built around earlier forms of transportation, railroad, and then subsequently the car. And now they're having to adapt yet again to kind of stitch back together some of the impacts that have happened. That's one of the things that we're going to talk about here today in our case studies. So what are we seeing in terms of trends? We're seeing connected communities being a huge driver. That used to be connected by the automobile primarily, at least in many of the cities and across the Midwest and beyond. But now we're seeing there's multiple modes of transportation, micromobility, pedestrianization, the increased use of rail, light rail, and intercity rail systems, as well as, of course, the gig economy with the use of shared resources like the automobile or electric scooters. In order for that to work, of course, we need to have places that we feel safe to move through. And that's requiring an adaptation of the infrastructure that was built in many of our cities focused really on rapid movement of the automobile. And so one of the trends that we're seeing is stitching back together, reconnecting communities that may have been divided through large infrastructure projects that rolled through as part of urban revitalization programs in the 50s and 60s here in the United States. And along the way, we realized that many of the moves that we made had negative impacts, and that those negative impacts are perhaps being accelerated due to rapid climate change. And so reevaluating the infrastructure systems that were put in place to increase resiliency while simultaneously increasing health and well-being, connectivity, and increasing the opportunity for information exchange, the human capital element, as well as economic exchange, transactions, so points of sale. Where can we experience new things, go shopping, have a coffee, basically enjoy some of the advantages of a pedestrian environment. Now, with any type of change within the urban environment, we get lots of complexity here. The displacements as one, housing typology or density morphs into another. You have economic discrepancies that can emerge from that as people with more disposable capital may move into an area to get access to desired amenities that has the potential to push people out. Balancing housing and getting the right level of land use between housing, office, retail, entertainment, cultural, education is always a challenge, and really falls on people who have to think about these issues long before we put pen to paper or put a shovel in the ground. And of course, making sure that we're creating job opportunities and access to those jobs, both locally as well as regionally, so that commutes for a wide range of economic backgrounds can get access to those jobs. And this is part of what makes everything so complex. One of the biggest trends that we're seeing, which adds an entirely new level of complexity, is the rapid deployment of renewable energy at the utility scale and the balancing of the electric demand with this urban development within the variable nature of those renewable sources, specifically wind and solar. And so in the background to everything that we're going to talk about within the urban realm is this infrastructure that supports the buildings, the urban spaces, the human capital, the intellectual capital, and the transactions that make the cities generators of the gross domestic product. So we've got rapidly deploying new technologies and new loads to balance in terms of the electric demand and when we have access to that electricity. And that is creating some interesting opportunities to integrate our transportation systems like electric vehicles with our electric generation systems like renewables, and managing that through not only the utility grid, but also microgrids that may exist, especially in some of these larger sites and larger developments within urban cores. So one of the things that we're seeing as we begin to plan out these larger developments at the district scale is beginning to shift away from natural gas as a component of the heating and cooling or even the manufacturing that may be going on in some of these sites. That's relatively new, a new way of thinking, a new way of planning, a new way of discussing infrastructure. And it's creating some really interesting opportunities to integrate our transportation systems, our energy systems, our water systems, and ultimately our building systems into a cohesive package. So I just want to kind of show some of the projects that have been going on where we're beginning to see some of these trends play out. One of the things that we're seeing is the need for transit-oriented development and using transportation as a way to spur the right type of development that balances the pedestrian environment multiple modes of mobility and economic opportunities. This is just an example in Hartford, the Hartford line in Connecticut, providing an interconnected multi-city as well as inner-city mobility system that using the proximity to those systems as a way to promote development and specific types of development within Hartford. Making sure that we're thinking about complete streets. No one is saying that the automobile is going away, but realizing that the automobile shares the streets with the public, the pedestrian, the bicyclist, and micromobility platforms in a way that is safe and inviting. And that actually, we know, creates additional economic revenue by generating more points of sale, a more pleasant environment, more safe environment. And this also is spurring the kind of reinvention or reimagining of the town center, thinking about what it means to have a live, work, play environment, a 15-minute walk to all the amenities and resources that you may need, what that lifestyle is like, and how technology connects it all together, whether that's Wi-Fi or just high-speed internet access, or thinking more about digital twins as a way to manage these assets and make sure that they maintain their profitability and efficiency. And one of the things that planners really need to really focus on is making sure that they are simply suggesting land use patterns and densities and creating the framework for these exchanges, these exchange of intellectual capital, human capital, and ultimately economic exchanges. So the examples you see here are just suggestive of buildings and providing guidelines to developers and visualizations to decision makers rather than explicitly developing architecture. One of the trends here is utilizing the abandoned space above many of our transportation systems. And that's an inherently expensive proposition to bridge over a large highway or rail system to stitch back together that scar. But the advantage of that is that it unlocks a lot of underutilized land within our urban cores. So you see here land bridge where reconnecting or expanding the usable space, whether it's parkland or developable land, to stitch back together a neighborhood which has been separated by a transportation system. Incredibly useful way to add value to land on both sides of the highway and to take what had been something that maybe buildings would turn their back to, or that may be seen as a negative to the land value, and flipping that and making it an amenity, covering it, reducing the noise or air quality issues through overdecking. And that is what the case study that I'm going to talk about here in just a little bit really strives to do. There's many examples of this happening at various scales across cities in the United States and elsewhere, where the input or the unlocking of the value of the air above these assets, the transportation assets, spurs on development and creates the opportunity for innovation corridors. We're seeing light manufacturing pop up around here because having access to the highway is important for distribution. Allowing landlocked or previously landlocked institutions like higher ed campuses, healthcare campuses, science and technology campuses expand into areas that were maybe on the fringe. So the area, the land directly adjacent to a transportation system or an infrastructure system, or directly above. And thinking about the flow of the pedestrian, the flow of multiple forms of mobility over or under these infrastructure systems that were built in the 60s and 50s to promote or to make automobile traffic more efficient in and around our cities. You know, I think at this particular time, sometimes there's a trend to thumb your nose at older technology or older technological solutions like highways without understanding the times or putting the decisions that were made at that time in context. The reality is that many of those transportation systems that were built in the 50s and 60s solved huge problems that the cities were facing, and it enabled transportation networks and the supply of goods and services to our cities. Now, it wasn't necessarily done the way that it was envisioned. You know, many of these were envisioned to be overdecked, but there wasn't enough money. And so now we have the opportunity to unlock that value by going back in and reevaluating those systems, thinking about how we interlace or intertwine or connect multiple forms of mobility there. And not only our transportation systems, but also other infrastructure systems, such as water management systems, culverts, realizing that the movement of water is important not only for flood prevention and water management, but also to create an amenity. So taking an area that may have been underutilized or at least not necessarily driving value and creating into amenity is a trend that we've seen for quite some time now, and we're expecting that will actually continue. Once that infrastructure system is converted into an amenity, it suddenly drives the value of the land and works as an attractor, and that can create new opportunities, generate new revenue for the cities. One of the things that is a challenge here in Chicago, as I begin to switch to our one central case study, is that a city government generates revenue primarily through taxation of some sort. And that taxation comes through the taxation on income through a city tax, direct income to individuals who are working and companies that are working in the city, and also through property tax, taxation of the land based off the perceived value of the land relative to its location. And so if you are looking to provide goods and services, social services to the residents within your city, your revenue stream has to come from those sources. There are other sources as well, but those are the primary ones. And you cannot tax your residents and your companies that reside and do business within your city out of a problem, right? So if you have a budget deficit, you can't continue to tax the residents, because at some point they move. The value proposition drops. They will relocate to a city that generates more disposable income for them through less taxes. And so it becomes the stewardship of the resources of the city, the infrastructure systems, the urban land, and the land use patterns is incredibly important for that revenue generation, and making sure that the land that's available, which is limited within most cities, can be a source of revenue in a way that's balanced with the percentage that is being taken and being then thus redistributed to the other residents through the social services. And so it becomes a true balancing act, and any land within urban cores in particular that is not generating a certain value becomes a liability, becomes an issue that has to be solved. And this is why we're seeing some of these older pieces of urban infrastructure be repositioned, rezoned, or reevaluated in a way that increases the revenue generation by adding value to them. And what generates value in a city? People do. Economic capital is directly linked to human capital. And development and smart development, land use patterns, is a way to really think through that pattern. So if we were to take, say, a rail yard, which was an important piece of urban infrastructure that allowed the industrial expansion of American cities across the Midwest. I'm just going to think about the Midwest for a little bit. The rail yard is an incredibly valuable piece of urban infrastructure that was built to enable the expansion of a city like Chicago rapidly by taking the goods and services that were manufactured there and distributing to other parts of the country, as well as delivering goods and services from other parts of the country to Chicago. That infrastructure still has value, absolutely has value, and cannot be taken away. But if you were to think about a large rail yard, how many people are there? How many jobs are there? And some of these sit within very close proximity to downtown urban cores, especially in Chicago, because the railroad came directly into the center of Chicago and still does today. So these large acres and acres of land are not generating as much revenue perhaps as they could or should. And so the question becomes, how can we reposition these urban assets in a way that maintains their inherent value as part of our transportation network, while simultaneously increasing the potential revenue generation for both public and private interests. And so with that, I want to switch over to One Central. We're going to talk a little bit about the project as a case study, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions. Before I switch over, are there any questions so far? Does anyone want to ask a question?
I just want to flag that Lindsay Zanders joined the call, and thank you, Lindsay, for being here. And I hope you could stay to the end for our discussion together. Thanks, man. It's been a great presentation so far. Looking forward to hearing about Chicago.
Great, thanks. Hey, Lindsay. Okay, give me 1 second to remember how to do this in Zoom. There we go. Okay, now I got it. Sorry about the delay. I'm going to share a different screen here. Okay, can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about One Central, which is a project that WSP has been supporting with a variety of other partners. Landmark is the master developer with a wide range of investment partners, including Citibank, Blue Capital, and a few others. This presentation is a bit dated, but it's publicly available. It was a presentation to the aldermen. We have a number of advisors who are working through the economic impacts, including AECOM and JLL. And then we have a series of engineers and architects, including Gensler, WSP, and Knight, as well as a wide range of other consultants and specialists to tackle various specialty areas of engineering, such as geotech. So at certain points, I'll have the original presenter speak, but I'm going to, for the sake of time, just kind of give a higher level overview by clicking through the slide deck here. The site is located in a really unique area. As you remember, I was talking about the train systems that come in. This train system into Chicago used to come in over the lake, and over the years through infill projects, that train system, that basically the lakeshore expanded out. Chicago has a history of capitalizing on by overdecking through its train system. So Grant Park and Millennium Park are both examples of assets that have been developed for the public by platforming over these large train infrastructure systems, and this both freight train historically as well as commuter train more recently. The One Central project lies over a multi-acre site that sits kind of nestled between the access point to the cultural campus, which is where the Shed Aquarium and Field Museum, Soldier Field sit in a large parkland system that's been built up over the years, and the city context itself on the south side of the city. Sorry, 1 second. The project has previously been a railroad station. That station was taken down as transit patterns shifted, but the goal here is to reinitialize that transit hub by through an overdeck process, where there you can see the train lines. Basically, the proposition is to deck over this in a way that improves connectivity at multiple scales, both the regional scale, the larger city context, and then the micro scale, which would be the immediate neighborhoods, in particular with focus on connecting along the north and south axis there along the lake. Additionally, it improves connectivity and transit options for the large sporting events and cultural activities that occur on the parkland to the right-hand side of the screen. So you can see that if you were to think about my comment before, if you were to count the number of jobs that were sitting on this parcel, or the number of points of sale or any other economic generators, it's very limited. Yes, there are jobs associated with it, and no one is saying that the train tracks need to go away. I think it's just a realization that the potential increase in economic revenue generation on both the public and private side could be expanded greatly by producing development patterns and land use patterns that have more density. And density is one of the key drivers to all the urban decisions that we make. So in order to do that, the proposition is to expand over, and there are two components to this plan development. The first is the Civic Build, which is the horizontal component that ultimately connects the parkland and cultural venues on the right-hand side of the screen with the urban context of Chicago on the left-hand side. That Civic Build, it supports the infrastructure, the mechanical systems, the parking, the transit systems, water, waste, sewer, on and on, that then enables density to occur. So now if you were to look at this rendering, you can see that there's a transit hub that enables the connectivity, allows access to the site, and then there's a wide range of cultural and retail opportunities, some mid-rise housing opportunities. That's the kind of catalyst at the ground level. We're basically creating a pedestrian street that runs to the north and south. There's connectivity to a wide range of different transportation networks, which we'll talk about more in a few slides, and the enabling infrastructure for the next phase, which would be to increase the population density with mixed-use development of a wide range of towers. This is not the first time this has been done. This has been done, obviously, in Hudson Yards in New York, as another example where there was underutilized space above a very important railroad connection point. Through platforming it, connecting it to things like the High Line, creating public realm, you're able to increase the value of that land tremendously. In order to make this all happen, of course, it requires both public and private entities. And so part of the capital planning includes a slightly unique strategy. This is a strategy that we see all the time in the UK and Canada, public-private partnerships. It's basically a relationship between public assets and public entities with private assets and private entities. The advantage of this is that it avoids a normal way that we see these types of urban infrastructure and urban developments be financed through a TIF, incremental tax financing, that basically reduces the TIF. The downside of the TIF is that the taxes that can be generated within the agreed upon time of the TIF arrangement is significantly reduced. There are still, the argument is that there's benefits, ancillary benefits through personal income taxes by creating more jobs, and then spin-off benefits in the areas adjacent to the development property where the property value and desired amenities increases as well. This takes a slightly different approach. I'm probably not the best person to explain all the details, but I think it's interesting in the fact that it creates a public-private relationship specifically around the transit systems and the transit hub in order to turn the asset over to the state, to a state and city to run after an agreed upon time. That then allows the state and city to generate the revenue, the benefits of this piece of urban infrastructure without having to provide the upfront capital to build it. Let me go back to my, so I want to take a few minutes here to talk a bit about the transit systems here. You can see the numerous transit systems kind of all come together. And then to increase the connectivity, the development also looks to utilize a private bus line that would allow for increased connectivity to other assets within the city, including Navy Pier, River North, and other large developments that are going on in the near vicinity of downtown Chicago. I'm going to skip to give me 1 second to get to the right time frame here. I'm just going to hit play and let some of the transit components and architectural endeavors be explained. If I can get my audio to work here. 1 second.
Hey, Matt, I don't think we hear the audio.
Got it. So this is basically it's referred to as the tri-line. It's a proposition to have a bus system that would be serving privately supported, but serving the downtown loop area. I'm going to skip over to the architectural buildup here and kind of talk through some of the components. So as we said, there's a existing rail yard, and at one point there was a proposition to have an extension of one of the existing CTA lines. The plan has evolved since then, so the applicability of where we're at currently may have changed. Then as a next phase, after some track realignment to allow the structure to engage with the ground, the Civic Build comes in, balancing out a wide range of retail and amenities, the implementation of a pedestrianized urban street, and below parking on a plinth that then spans over the tracks. Parking has already begun to accommodate electric vehicles, rideshare, and other forms of mobility. Then through a phased build out series of privately developed towers that then connect into the Civic Build. The exact massing is to be determined, but the advantage of the towers you probably have learned is a dramatic increase in density. And of course, when you have density, what you need is the infrastructure, the transportation infrastructures to allow mobility access to and from these new towers coming in along the lakeshore. So if we go back in, we look at the development patterns in and around what was originally referred to as Central Station and is now becoming One Central. There's a strong connection to some of the land use patterns that have historically existed and the ability to access the transportation networks that are in and around Chicago. So one of the propositions is that this enhancement to the connectivity of the existing transportation systems spurs economic development, not only on the site, but in the surrounding areas by creating jobs and perhaps most importantly, providing access to those jobs. This kind of gives you some context to other developments, similar development pattern over on this side of the city over the last 15, 20 years, increased density in areas that were previously underutilized, generating large amounts of revenue for the city through property taxes as well as personal income taxes. Anytime you're beginning to adjust or add, subtract to an existing land use pattern, there's always fear and concern regarding the impact of that change. And that's where a lot of the engineering comes in, being able to think through those and predict the changes that will occur, begin to come up with strategies that ideally enhance the overall urban environments rather than creating problems. And that's where I think the transportation studies that were done to assess how this could possibly be implemented and the potential benefits came in. We worked closely with Gensler, also looking at the relationship and scale of the buildings and what the appropriate density would be to maximize the potential value for the site without degrading the urban quality. And in fact, the primary goal is to enhance it. So you can see some of the current conditions, and then through the overdeck process, you're creating more green space, more landscape, creating this urban pedestrian corridor that ties into the transit hub that allows a pedestrian environment to expand to regionally because of the connectivity to the trains that are moving down below. And then an additional pedestrian bridge to increase connectivity to the entertainment and cultural venues, as well as park space and ultimately the lake here, which is a huge draw to the site already. And providing additional access points and transportation options is a key driver. So if you're to think about the number of jobs, the number of points of sale that can begin to populate this area, which currently supports very few jobs, and the corresponding revenue that could be generated for the city through various forms of taxation, it becomes a win-win. The city gains revenue, private development gains revenue. You end up with an enhanced urban space. You're creating new experiences, new places, new forms of identity, and increased connectivity to an existing amenity. These are the types of projects that get me very excited because the impact that they have is so substantial. But so are the challenges. Obviously, a development this large has a pretty significant impact on the existing infrastructure systems, including water, waste, energy, transportation, mobility, and the communities. And those need to be managed and thought through planning, through design, through collaboration with a wide range of experts, including construction managers, program managers, transit engineers, rail and track engineers, highway engineers, the ability to simulate pedestrian movements, the ability to think through the economic impacts, and not only on the design side, but what we're finding in many of our projects is that the asset management of a development like this, especially when it's both public and private, becomes critical to the long-term success of the development. It's not a one and done, but it's a long-term commitment. And so we're deploying tools like digital twins and building information modeling to make sure that the asset can be managed, a very complex asset can be managed across multiple stakeholders over a long period of time. And ultimately, sustainability and carbon reductions have to factor into our planning as well, thinking about the amount of electricity, where do we use natural gas, where do we not use natural gas. You know, these decisions impact us well into the future, and the development, of course, has to respond to and be flexible to adapt to changes in the infrastructure, in the economy, as well as in the population of Chicago and cities like it. So with that, I wanted to kind of open things back up, answer any questions that might exist. I could talk about this for hours, and if you want to learn more, there's plenty publicly available as well. This particular video comes from it's on YouTube. It was a community engagement webinar that was sponsored by the alderman who oversees this particular area of Chicago.
Matt, that's a presentation. Thank you so much, and also for putting it in context. The comes to case studies in Miami and Hartford. You know, you also in passing Hudson Yards seems New Yorkers to be large and transformational, but seems very sparse to the numbers of square area shown here. What enables Hudson Yards extension of the 7 line without the transit improvements, Hudson Yards could not exist from Penn State wherever they're field. You've talked a little bit about transit improvements might be happening here. We had an interesting presentation with Carol Ross Barney, and talking about the CTA station at McCormick. What's the status of scheduling for the CTA that would make accessibility to the site easier?
At one point there was a discussion about a spur or an extension, and I think the CTA is, I don't know what the status of that currently is, but in theory, at some point that would seem to make sense. If not, then coming up with other connection points is really not that hard. There are transit stations nearby, and as you mentioned before, McCormick Place. Really, the more we can connect McCormick Place to other components of the city, the better off it is for everyone, because it's one of the primary access points for tourists to then come and engage with the city at large.
Yeah, and the position of this particular site is nice in the sense that if you guys have ever visited Chicago, I highly recommend it. But if you've wanted to go to like the museum campus, you realize, hey, I'm downtown. I wish there was an easy way to get there, but you're like walking forever. And then you finally get there. Same thing with Soldier Field, which is right there on the east. It's right between this development and the lake. Again, people wanting to go to football games or that sports kind of centralization there, they have to walk forever. And this particular site, it had 3 main rail connection points of one, the commuter rail, which is the Metra here. That's basically the line that goes out to the suburbs. and can bring people in. And so then that way we're not clogging the streets with more cars. Then there's the CTA, which is kind of like the city train, like the 7. I lived actually in Hell's Kitchen before they did Hudson Yards. And I remember going out to the Javits Center thinking, God, I'm walking forever. That last mile, especially with, inclusion and accessibility to people, it was kind of off on that island, almost on the island. Anyway, so they had the CTA, they had the Metra, and then there's also the freight line that we are straddling over. So then that way they could get commerce in and out. And so that's why they introduced that 4th street transportation with that bus line to be like, listen, I wish the transit system was like New York, where you can virtually get anywhere it goes. It goes across, up and down, sideways. In Chicago, it's not quite that crosshatch of density. And so if you include that bus line, it could get you to those places. So you're not walking forever to get to the museum campus or to Soldier Field or up to Navy Pier, or connecting you to the west side of the loop where there's some more office type occupancy there.
Lindsay, Rick, can I follow up with a question? Is that okay?
Please.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you for that clarification. So let me understand this, what you mentioned. So there is not going to be a station there for people to arrive to this location? I know you mentioned that there is, this rail line is used by multiple transportation systems, but are they going to add okay, so the transit hub, but that's not a bus. That is actually a stop for CTA.
Well, it is definitely going to be a stop for the Metra, the commuter line, and the thought was CTA was going to intersect into it. The funny thing in Chicago, which was a fun challenge for us, and you guys have this in New York too, is some of your lines are here, some of your lines are here, and some of your lines are here. And in Chicago, we have the subway and we have the elevated, which is separated by like 6 stories, right? And the commuter, the Metro line is at grade, if not a little bit subgrade. So now we're trying to smush all that into one very large building in order to connect them all. The status of the very highest line coming in, which is the L, the CTA, that was going to be a spur off of was that the green line that we were doing? I have to relook at the plans. That I think is still in negotiation. Like that was always part of the plan, but there have been some either political or
it's just a money and resources. So yeah, the idea hasn't gone away. But to your point, though, there are other. This sits on about a 4-story plinth to span and provide the utility infrastructure over the deck. And within that plinth, there's private parking as well as bus connections. So yes, this is connected to the bus system, both the Chi line as well as other CTA systems. And that really is the primary function of the transit hub, to connect the vertical systems here with the pedestrian street through vertical connectivity through elevators, escalators, stairwells, etc. And then the systems, you kind of have entry points from, in particular, from here and here. Both pedestrian, bicycle, micromobility, automobile, bus, and rail.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. So especially with being on it, if anything too controversial, comparing yards and thinking of this as transit-oriented development. I mean, the other thing that is an interesting comparison is that it kind of extends the center of the city. Such a so many people who are visiting Chicago for conferences that it seems so inevitable how the transit works is fundamental to it. I have one other question. Going to from time to time and seeing overlooks, if you will, from the adjacent bars and housing and whatnot. Same in Baltimore at the baseball stadium. Why is the resident component to the north and the more commercial and hotel development to the south? Does that relate to upland and inland? I would have thought around here you might want the hotels or.
Well, the hotel on the south side of the development is actually
Yeah.
McCormick Place.
Right. Okay. So it
And-
serves the convention center. Got it.
Yeah, and on the north end of the development is the Loop, and the Loop for us is like the Midtown. Like this is where all of
Yeah.
all the businesses are, and there's already a high density of hotels there. So it's
Yeah.
like, why add another hotel there when you can
Right.
add it to McCormick Place, where it
Where
may
it's
make
needed.
more sense, a balance.
Yeah.
And then
So-
residential wise, you're finding, especially post-COVID, like they're like, well, hey, I want to invest in where I live, and they just happen to have accessible to the city right here.
Yeah.
So it makes these kind of developments even more desirable of like, hey, I've got the city at my fingertips, and I have my home, and I have my office. So.
Got it. Yeah, are there questions from the students? I could ask questions, Matt. Let's see. Some information about this, about tech. What questions are on your mind? Anyway.
I can ask another. I actually have another question. When is the kind of the timing wise? I know that with COVID there has been a big impact. How is trending compared to the original plan? Do you have any information about that?
The exact timing, I'm not entirely sure about. We've been going through pricing exercises, and obviously there's ongoing negotiations with multiple government agencies. But beyond that, probably the best source of information or update would be the One Central home website. They keep that fairly up to date with new developments.
Thank you.
One detail, bus system, the private bus system, this relatively small, it looked like the vehicle was driverless. Are you talking about another system in the future, or is that for the sake of the rendering?
It's ongoing negotiations with some potential vendors who would provide that, whether it's driverless or not. I think that's to be determined. I think the reality is that at some point in the future, we'll be seeing those types of driverless vehicles in and around Chicago. But to date, I think there was a lot of early optimism about that about 2018, and I think it's subsided a bit here. We've got an entire team looking at driverless vehicles and their impact on the urban environment, which would be completely separate from, of course, from One Central. But where we're seeing the most rapid development related to driverless vehicles is actually in delivery systems. It's a combination of driverless vehicles and drones for last mile operations.
Not on this drawing, but on another one, there was adjacent hub, I think in that sort of triangular area, Mass Park. That at least in principle, amenity of connecting, existing housing and community to this radically changed area. Can you describe a little bit how that's going to, who's maintaining it? Is it part of the park system or is it part of the development?
You broke up a bit there, but are you talking about on the plinth, on the Civic Build itself?
Well, on another plan, or there was a place called Mass Transit Park. Is that a public or part of the development?
It would be part of the development, privately maintained.
And you know what? This is interesting. There's a few of these creating a neighborhood in Chicago going on right now. None of them have really picked up a lot of momentum, I should say, because it's a very large endeavor. This is this is a decade-long kind of commitment, multiple decades, and each one of them are introducing very large green spaces. And in the discussions with the Chicago Park District, the thought was, hey, we're going to create a park and we're just going to turn it over to you. And the Chicago Park District was like, you know what, we're good. In the sense, they love the idea, they champion the idea of like, yes, keep green spaces or create, like in this particular case, there wasn't any green space. It is rail yards. So they are actually introducing new green to previous concrete jungle. The Park District, the way they view it is like, look, it will take additional resources, bodies, lawn care, you name it, to maintain these green spaces that didn't exist before. So if the developer commits to creating them, then they will permit the developer to maintain it themselves.
Yep.
And so then this way, it's not technically a public park, but it is open to the public, and it's just someone else is paying the bill to water the lawn, kind of deal.
Yeah. And with Little Island and other places, around, same arrangements, in whether it's 20 years or younger, you always toward the end time period, and does it get extended and renegotiated, or does it really revert to the public? May not have the resources to do it, right? But the financial discussion is phenomenally interesting, and thank you both for both the presentation and balance, the urban design aspects, the construction challenge, the changes, and also, and what a great team that you have, to work with on this.
This is so, I mean, we could talk for hours on this, because the engineering and the city planning alone on this, of like, you are creating a neighborhood that didn't exist.
Yeah.
Like, how are you going to feed this with water, with power, with sewage? Like it is like the engineering behind this is so cool. Yeah. And you have to do it all suspended over a rail yard. And right. So if a pipe breaks, you can't be like, oh, I'm sorry, train. Can you just pause for a second? It's like, no, that's not going to happen. So not only are you like having to figure out, how do I create a new neighborhood, like the infrastructure behind a neighborhood, but then how do I maintain it without just like literally derailing a train?
Politics were mentioned, and the duration of any project of this scale obviously spans several different mayoral administrations from to complete. You may find there are or mayors, depending on term limits, continuity. Yards went to be, but for Dan Doctor's empowerment by Bloom, whether it was the finding, or just the making it happen. Is there a single person, political, technical, who can claim credit for the inception of this, or was it just an inevitable extension of the Burnham Plan?
There are multiple studies that have been done over the last, probably 30 years, done by the Urban Land Institute and other both public and professional organizations that identify the decking over the railroad scars as being an important component of future urban development. That in part was true at Navy Pier, as well as at Millennium Park, which are two kind of really unique components of the Burnham Plan, which have been completed incrementally. And any, like you were saying, Rick, any public-private relationship of this scale is a multi-year, multi-decade thing, and it gets harder and harder for one individual to lay any credit. I would say that ultimately the Burnham Plan is a fun thing to reference and go back to, because it's had such a huge impact on the way Chicago viewed itself as it transformed from a rapidly growing industrial outpost to what it is today, which is an integral part of our transportation economy across the Midwest, as well as information and technology hub, banking hub, education hub for the Midwest as well. So no, I don't think there's one person that can lay claim. I think Landmark does deserve credit for having the capacity to take on something like this, build the team, build the vision, but it is done in lockstep with a huge number of public agencies that have their say, community engagement, which also are an important part of this. And of course, making it happen is a multi-year, multi-pronged endeavor. But man, wouldn't it be great if we could get this one built?
Yep. Well,
Yeah.
again, thank you. Looking forward to coming to Chicago in June for the IA conference and looking at Soldier Field Place and everything in between, in a different context, knowing what is going to be happening. So thank you both for the presentation. The method that we've had in Madrid during our January study, what a contradiction in terms, not two presentations, but to use the same link, so that attempted not to come back after the first hour. So Lindsay, please, if time, linger with us for a while if you want.